There is something that does not fit cleanly into any category we have for human beings. He was not physically imposing. He was not wealthy. He held no official power, no military rank, no political office. He stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, spent most of his adult life behind bars, and never personally committed the murders that made his name synonymous with something people struggle to name precisely. Not simply violence, not simply madness, something closer to the idea that a human being, through the quiet and patient application of psychological manipulation, can reach into other people's minds and rearrange what is there, can take ordinary young people, people with families and futures and ordinary fears, and transform them into instruments of something they would have called unthinkable before they met him. His name was Charles Manson, and the most disturbing thing about his story is not the murders. It is what had to happen inside one human being, over decades, for those murders to become possible at all. Before the photographs, before the swastika carved into his forehead, before the courtroom theatrics and the magazine covers and the decades of cultural mythology. Before all of it, there was a child. A small, unwanted child who learned something very early about the world, something that most people never learn, or learn and then choose to forget. He learned that people could be read, that their fears and their hungers and their need to be loved were not walls but doors, and that if you learned to open those doors quietly enough, you could walk inside and rearrange everything. What formed him was not a single wound, it was an accumulation, a pattern. And that pattern began long before anyone understood what it was becoming. If this kind of psychological storytelling reaches into something you have been searching for, consider subscribing to Black Pattern. This channel is built for people who want to understand not just what criminals did, but how they became capable of doing it. Like this video if it is giving you something to think about. Leave a comment with what you find most disturbing about cases like this. And stay with us, because this story is only beginning. Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother was Kathleen Maddox, a 16-year-old girl who, by most accounts, was neither prepared nor particularly willing to raise a child. She had her own chaos to manage. She drank heavily, moved through relationships that offered her little stability, and was reportedly arrested for armed robbery when Charles was still very young. There are accounts of her attempting to trade her son for a pitcher of beer at a diner. Whether that specific story is literally accurate or has accumulated the distortions that legends always gather, the emotional truth it points toward is supported by everything that followed. Charles Manson grew up understanding, at a level beneath language, that he was not wanted. Not in the way most children experience that fear in moments and then have it soothed away. He experienced it as a structural fact of his existence. His father was listed on his birth certificate as Colonel Walker Scott, though the relationship was never formalized and the man was not present in any meaningful way. Manson carried his mother's maiden name and later the surname of a man named William Manson, who briefly married Kathleen. That marriage also did not last. What Charles had, in the place where family should have been, was a series of absences interrupted by occasional instability. He was placed with an aunt and uncle for a period, reportedly living in West Virginia in a household that was strict and, by some accounts, had its own undertow of emotional severity. He returned to his mother when she was released from prison, but the returns were never what a child imagines when he imagines going home. Home, for Charles Manson, was not a place. It was a recurring disappointment. Psychologists and biographers who have studied his early life have often pointed to this period as foundational, not simply because of the neglect, but because of what the neglect taught him. A child who is consistently failed by the adults who are supposed to love them unconditionally faces a developmental crossroads. Some internalize the failure as evidence of their own unworthiness. Some learn to dissociate from their own need for connection. And some, particularly those with certain temperamental qualities, a sharp social intelligence, a sensitivity to the emotional states of others, a capacity for careful observation, learn to become students of human vulnerability. They study what people want. They study what people fear. They study how to provide the appearance of what people want in order to obtain something in return. There is no way to know exactly what was forming in Charles Manson's mind during those early years. But his behavior in the years that followed suggests that the lesson he took from his childhood was not that he was unworthy of love. It was that love, like everything else, was a transaction, and that he intended to be the one controlling the terms. He was sent to the Gebolt School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, when he was around 12 years old. This was a reform school, and it would be the first of many institutions that would mark the next several decades of his life. He ran away repeatedly. He committed petty crimes. He stole cars. He broke into grocery stores. Each time he was caught, he was returned to an institution, and each institution hardened something in him rather than softening it. The criminal justice system, as it encountered Charles Manson during his adolescence and early adulthood, did not rehabilitate him. It educated him. It placed him in environments where the primary social curriculum was the study of manipulation, survival, dominance, and the exploitation of weakness. By the time he was a teenager, Manson had developed a quality that people who encountered him throughout his life would consistently remark upon. He was watchful, intensely, almost uncomfortably watchful. He had the quality of someone who is always reading the room, always measuring the people around him, always calculating what role to perform and what need to simulate. In institutional settings, where survival often depends on the ability to read the dominant power structures and position oneself carefully within them, this quality served him. But it also meant that the version of himself he presented was always a construction, always a performance calibrated for effect. He spent time at the Boys Town facility in Nebraska, the reform institution made famous in the 1938 film. He arrived claiming to be eager for a fresh start. He left after 4 days, having convinced another boy to help him steal a car and commit armed robbery on the way out. The gap between the performance and the reality was already, at 12 or 13 years old, a defining characteristic. At the Indiana Boys' School, there were reports of sexual assault and physical violence. The environments he was placed in to correct his behavior were themselves environments of cruelty, and whatever structures of conscience might have formed under different circumstances were instead subjected to sustained pressure in the opposite direction. He learned that the weak were preyed upon. He learned that safety came from being the one doing the preying, or from being useful to those who were. What is important here is not simply the catalog of institutions and offenses, though that catalog is long and consistent. What is important is the psychological architecture being built during these years. Manson was developing a worldview in which other people were not ends in themselves, but means, in which relationships were instruments of leverage, in which his own emotional needs, if he felt them at all in the conventional sense, were something to be concealed rather than expressed, because expression meant exposure, and exposure meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was something the world had already demonstrated it would punish. He was, by most psychological assessments conducted later in his life, someone who would today be described in terms of severe personality pathology. But it is important to be careful here, because the language of diagnosis, applied retroactively, can create a false sense of tidiness. What Manson was could not be fully explained by a diagnosis. It was the product of a particular person, with particular temperamental qualities, passing through a particular sequence of environments that systematically reinforced the worst possible adaptations. He was also, and this is crucial to understanding what came later, intelligent. Not in every dimension, but in the specific dimension that mattered most to what he was becoming. He was socially and emotionally intelligent in the way that predators are intelligent. He understood people. He understood what they were hungry for. He understood that most people, no matter how stable their exterior, carry inside them some version of the same hunger he had known. The hunger to be seen, to matter, to belong to something that gives life meaning. And he understood that if you could position yourself as the answer to that hunger, you could obtain almost anything. He was released from federal prison in 1967. He had spent the majority of his adult life incarcerated. He was 32 years old. He had asked, reportedly, to remain in prison because the outside world felt foreign to him after so many years of institutional life. That request was denied. He was released into San Francisco at a particular historical moment that, in retrospect, appears almost designed to provide him with exactly the raw material he needed. The late 1960s in California were a time of extraordinary social upheaval. The counterculture was in full expression. Young people were rejecting the frameworks that had structured their parents' lives. Traditional authority was suspect. Spiritual searching was intense and often indiscriminate. Communities formed around charismatic figures who promised liberation, transcendence, meaning. The pharmacological and social experiments of the era had loosened the psychological structures that ordinarily help people evaluate what they are being offered. And there was an abundance of young people, many of them from difficult backgrounds, many of them running from something, many of them desperately in need of what Manson had spent his entire life learning to simulate. He began gathering people almost immediately. His methods were not dramatic at first. He did not announce himself as a messiah or a prophet. He presented himself as someone who had been outside society, outside the conventional constraints, and had therefore seen something others had missed. He played guitar reasonably well and spoke in a way that blended scraps of Scientology, which he had encountered in prison, with fragments of the Bible, with the language of the counterculture, with whatever else seemed to be landing with his audience. The people he gathered were primarily young women. This was not accidental. Women who were lost, who were fleeing abuse or neglect or simple unhappiness, who were searching for purpose, who had been taught to find their identity through their relationships with men, were particularly vulnerable to what he was offering. And what he was offering was absolute attention, the sense of being truly seen and truly chosen. He was skilled at identifying what each individual needed most and providing a version of it. With some, it was spiritual meaning. With others, it was the experience of belonging to a family, which for many of them was something they had never had in any real sense. This was not love. It is important to be clear about that. Manson did not love these people. What he felt toward them, to the extent that we can understand it from the documented evidence of his behavior and statements, was closer to ownership. They were an extension of his power. Their obedience was proof of his ability to control reality. Their willingness to do anything he asked was confirmation of the worldview he had constructed over decades of institutional life, that the world was a hierarchy of dominance, and that the only meaningful position in that hierarchy was at the top. He moved his growing group, which would come to be called the Manson Family, though he reportedly disliked that term, through various locations before eventually settling at Spahn Ranch, a former movie ranch in the hills northwest of Los Angeles. The ranch was run by an elderly, nearly blind man named George Spahn, and the family provided labor and companionship in exchange for a place to live. The location was isolated. The isolation was functional. Isolation, as Manson understood from his own childhood and from what he had observed in institutional settings, is one of the most effective tools of psychological control. When people are cut off from external reference points, from friends and family who might offer perspective, from the ordinary social feedback that helps people calibrate their sense of reality, they become increasingly dependent on whoever controls the environment for their understanding of the world. At Spahn Ranch, Manson controlled the environment completely. He controlled the food, the sleeping arrangements, the daily structure, the sexual relationships, the spiritual framework. He told his followers what the world outside meant, and they had limited means of checking his interpretation. He had the group engage in marathon group sessions where individuals were pressured to confess their fears, their ego, their attachments to their previous identities. This process, which drew on techniques Manson had encountered in various forms during his years of incarceration and institutional processing, systematically dismantled the psychological structures that allow people to say no, to have a boundary, to feel that their own perspective on reality is as valid as anyone else's. He told them, in various formulations, that the self was an illusion, that ego was the enemy. That surrendering individual will to the group, and specifically to him as the group's center, was the path to liberation. This is not an unusual message in certain spiritual traditions. What made it dangerous was that it was not offered in the service of genuine spiritual development. It was offered in the service of Manson's need for absolute control. And when the dissolution of ego is weaponized by a person who does not believe in it himself, who is in fact operating from an extraordinarily armored and defended sense of self, what you produce is not liberation. What you produce is people who have been systematically disconnected from their own capacity to resist. By 1969, something was shifting. The recordings Manson had made with the hope of becoming a professional musician had not resulted in the career he had anticipated. The connection he had cultivated with figures in the music industry, most notably through a friendship with Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, had produced a single recorded track but nothing resembling the recognition he believed he deserved. This is not a trivial detail. Manson's need for recognition, for the world to confirm that he was what he believed himself to be, was not a passing ambition. It was structural to his psychology, and the failure to obtain it through legitimate channels appears to have accelerated something. His ideology had been developing throughout the preceding years. He spoke increasingly about a coming race war, which he called Helter Skelter, a term taken from the Beatles song of the same name. He believed, or professed to believe, and it is genuinely difficult to determine where performance ended and delusion began in Manson, that this war was imminent, that black people would rise up and kill white people, that the family would survive by retreating to a hidden city beneath the California desert, and that after the war, the family would emerge to lead, because the victors would need someone to tell them what to do. Whether Manson genuinely believed this, or whether it was a narrative constructed to provide his followers with a sense of apocalyptic purpose, the practical function it served was the same. It created urgency. It created the sense that ordinary moral constraints did not apply, that the world was ending, that extraordinary action was required. And it provided a framework in which the crimes he was moving toward could be understood not as crimes, but as contributions to a larger design. On the night of August 8, 1969, members of the Manson family, acting on his instructions, entered a home on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles and killed 5 people. The victims were Sharon Tate, a 26-year-old actress who was 8.5 months pregnant, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. The following night, family members killed Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in their home in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Manson did not participate directly in the killings. He sent others to do what he wanted done. This is consistent with everything that had come before. His power was always expressed through others. His method was never direct. It was mediated through people whose psychological defenses he had systematically eroded until they were capable of doing what he required. The people who committed these acts were not born killers. They were ordinary young people who had, through a process of sustained psychological manipulation in conditions of social isolation, been transformed into something they could not have imagined being before they met Charles Manson. That transformation is perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire case. Not because it excuses what they did, it does not, but because it reveals something about human psychological vulnerability that most people prefer not to examine too closely. The trial that followed was unlike most criminal proceedings. Manson, who was not charged with the physical acts of murder but with conspiracy, conducted himself in a way that demonstrated, paradoxically, both his intelligence and his fundamental limitation. He was theatrical. He carved an X into his forehead and was subsequently copied by members of his family who were on trial alongside him. He shouted. He held up newspapers. He performed constantly for the cameras and the spectators and whoever he imagined was watching. The performance was designed to communicate that he was beyond the reach of ordinary judgment, that the court had no authority over someone who had already transcended conventional reality. But what the performance actually communicated to anyone watching carefully was something different. It communicated the profile of someone who had always needed the world to confirm his own exceptional status, and who, when the world failed to do so on his terms, manufactured confirmation through any means available. The courtroom was simply the latest stage on which he had always performed. He was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder in January 1971. His death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment when California briefly abolished the death penalty in 1972. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. He was denied parole numerous times. He died on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83, at a hospital in Bakersfield, California, of heart failure. He had been incarcerated for 55 of his 83 years. What do we make of Charles Manson? That question has been asked in thousands of books and articles and documentaries and academic papers and casual conversations, and the answers have tended toward the sensational or the reductive. He was a genius of manipulation. He was a failed musician who turned his bitterness into a weapon. He was the dark side of the 1960s. He was the moment when the flower generation's dream curdled into something poisonous. All of these framings contain fragments of something real, but none of them quite reaches the center of what his life actually reveals. What his life reveals is a pattern that did not begin with a decision to become evil, because that is not how these things work. It began with a child who was abandoned before he could understand what abandonment meant, who learned, in the absence of reliable love, to study people for leverage rather than connection, who passed through institutional environments that systematically reinforced the worst possible adaptations, who developed, over decades, a psychology oriented entirely around the acquisition and maintenance of control over others, who discovered, at a particular moment in history, that the specific hungers of a specific generation of young people made them vulnerable to what he had learned to simulate. He was not a genius. He was not special in the way he believed himself to be. He was a deeply damaged person whose particular set of skills, if that word can be applied here without discomfort, happened to find a particular set of circumstances, and the result was catastrophe. 7 people died. More were psychologically destroyed. The people who believed in him and followed his instructions spent decades in prison and will spend the rest of their lives carrying the weight of what they did. And he spent his last decades in a small cell, giving interviews in which he still performed, still constructed himself, still insisted on his own significance. The need for control never left him. The need to be seen as exceptional never diminished. Until the end, he was the most important person in whatever room he occupied, even when that room was a prison cell, even when the only people listening were journalists who had come to write about him for the 10,000th time. The warning signs were there from the beginning, not the signs that something dramatic was coming, because early warning signs rarely look like what they will eventually produce. The signs were quieter than that. A child who had learned not to need anyone, because needing was dangerous. An adolescent who was brilliant at reading people and using what he read. A young man who was comfortable only in environments where the rules were clear and he could find his place within the hierarchy of power. An adult who discovered that certain kinds of people, under certain kinds of conditions, could be taught to dissolve themselves. The world did not fail to notice Charles Manson. The world noticed him repeatedly. Schools, institutions, courts, prisons, all of them processed him and returned him and processed him again. What the world failed to do was understand what was forming inside him, and that failure was not the result of indifference. It was the result of something more troubling. The world looked at him and saw something manageable, something that could be processed, contained, and eventually released. Something ordinary. He was not ordinary, but he was also not what the mythology has made him. He was not a master of dark arts or a uniquely powerful force of psychological evil. He was the product of what happens when certain vulnerabilities, certain environments, certain learned adaptations, and certain historical moments converge. He was what a human being can become when the conditions for genuine human development are comprehensively denied, and when what grows in their place is never interrupted, never challenged, never redirected. The 7 people who were killed on those August nights in 1969 were not symbols. They were people with lives and futures and people who loved them. That fact tends to get lost in the decades of cultural attention that has been paid to Manson himself, to his eyes and his words and his strange charisma. It is worth holding that fact clearly. The violence was not abstract. The harm was not symbolic. Real human beings died because one person, over the course of a lifetime, had never been given what human beings require in order to develop into people capable of caring about other people. That is not an excuse. It is not an explanation that removes responsibility. It is something harder than an excuse. It is a recognition that what Manson became required conditions, and that those conditions are not unique to him. They exist in the world, right now, in various degrees, in various forms. The lesson of his life is not that monsters emerge from nowhere. It is that the transformation from a suffering child into a person capable of producing that kind of devastation takes time. It leaves traces. It follows patterns. The most frightening thing about Charles Manson was never his charisma. It was never the swastika or the stare or the letters he wrote from prison. The most frightening thing was how long it took. How many people encountered him along the way. How many systems processed him and released him back into the world. How the pattern was always there, from the very beginning, if anyone had known what to look for. In the end, the darkness was not hidden in his face. It was hidden in the pattern, and the pattern, as always, had been forming long before anyone thought to look.